Okay, here we go again. Those of you who have been watching my other videos know that I keep saying how Old Norse myths should be read as metaphorical allegories and parables. I have given a few examples on how the translation of names provide new insight into the metaphysical worldview of the Viking Age pagan, and I have given some comparable examples to explain how a mythical parable may work. I still haven't really gotten to the subject, however, namely exactly how I claim that Old Norse myths should be understood. If you have watched my Old Norse myths of initiation videos, you may have a clue as to how I do understand these myths, and you might as well, because I keep circling around the main subject. Why go there directly when you can have your fun? There's so many interesting subjects on the way. So today I'm going to explain why I keep saying that Old Norse myths are metaphorical with such authority. You see, I don't say that just because I think so. I say that because it's obvious to anyone who has ever studied Old Norse poetry. It has to do with the Old Norse rules of poetry, with the terms heiti and kenning. Old Norse terms that refer to metaphors. In 1225 AD, the Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson wrote a whole book about the subject, parts of which has become known as the famous prose Edda. And I will provide more information about these terms and Snorri's work in the description, because now I want to go straight to today's subject, namely exactly how a typical Old Norse metaphor would work. For dramatic effects, let us imagine a credible and, I must say, an alarmingly commonplace Viking Age scenario, the aftermath of a battle. We are back in time, say 1,200 years, a Norwegian fjord, perhaps just before the age of piracy, which is what the Viking Age actually means. Norway was not yet one country. It was just a cluster of countless little kingdoms and chiefdoms. So let's say we have a victorious tribe. Let us say that they call their leader by the title of king. Now the king wants to celebrate his victory and honor the dead. They are in fact going to hold a funeral feast. In Norway, we still call that kind of feast gravøl, which means grave beer, which actually again basically means that up until quite recently, my ancestors celebrated the departed by getting dead drunk. Today we drink coffee. Now, despite the fact that the plan was for everybody to get absolutely plastered, the burial feast was still a sacred occasion, and the king turned to his most respected bard, the royal skald, and asked him to compose a suitable poem that was to be performed in the feast hall a bit before everybody had too much to drink. And the skald, well aware of the sacredness of his profession, would go somewhere suitable, like a burial mound on which he would sit. Or perhaps he would sit beneath the corpse of a hanged enemy sacrificed to Odin. Or maybe he would just sit at the battlefield where all these people had died recently. This practice was called the utiseta, which means to sit out, and basically meant that anyone seeking inspiration or knowledge from the spirits, or visions from the gods, or information from the dead, they would go to so-called crossroads, where the borders between the spheres of the borders between life and death were basically blurred. And Alright, so he goes to this place. The poet knows that his poem will have to graphically describe the battle. It has to honor those warriors who died courageously, whether enemy or friend. It has to ridicule the enemy warriors who may have behaved cowardly. And it has to honor and praise the king, and assure everybody how much the king is favored by the gods. So the poet had probably himself partaken in the battle, as every free and able-bodied man was a warrior in those days. It doesn't matter if he was a farmer or a bard or a craftsman or a merchant, he would be a warrior if he could. That was the mark of a free man. So now he sits outside on his chosen spot and is trying to mentally compose a poem. There is no pen, there is no paper, just his mind at work, and the poem will be spoken and listened to, not read. So the poet remembers. He remembers back to before the battle, standing next to his king, watching the first enemy ship slowly approaching into the fjord. Ah, a ship. There is the start. He will start by describing the enemy ship. A magnificent sight, both terrifying and glorious. So how shall the poet make an appropriate metaphor for ship? Because there are rules of poetry, rules that demand that the poet may not just say ship. He has to rewrite the whole concept of ship, or he's no poet. So a ship is something you ride when you're at sea and may be likened to a horse. So the first layer of the metaphor may be the horse of the ocean established. But this was a common metaphor for ship, even in daily speech. In those days, even daily speech was strongly metaphorical. But this is sacred poetry, and the poet is not satisfied with an everyday figure of speech. No, horse can be replaced by steed. Yeah, steed. And ocean can be replaced by waves. So the second layer of the metaphor is steed of the waves. Now that is still too common for our poet, it's what else, he has to think, what else than a horse or a ship may be a steed? Well, in his time, nothing, unless you look to the steeds of the gods. The third layer of the metaphor takes us into the mythical realm. Let us see. What about a boar? The god Freyr, he rides a boar. But that's not a suitable metaphor because it's too positive. The boar is a metaphor in itself, a symbol that is of fertility and abundance, and thus the allusion will be wrong. We're not talking about our ship, we're talking about their ship, and their ship is deadly and dangerous, and our poet wants to stress that fact. So, what else? Oh yeah, a wolf. A wolf is the steed of Hel, the goddess of death. All right, that will give the proper feeling of dread and hostility and certain death that the poet wants to transmit. The poet settles for wolf, wolf of the waves. Okay, so then he turns to the other part of the metaphor, which is waves. The word wave has to be taken into the third layer of the metaphor, to be taken into the same mythical realm. Now that's easy because in the mythical realm, waves are identified as the 9 daughters of the sea god Aegir and the sea goddess Ran. So choose either parent. Let's choose the father Aegir. Then you have to move into the fourth layer of the metaphor because you can't just go using the real and obvious name. You have to make a little riddle about it. That's the rule. So you look for things that are typical of Aegir, the sea god, and voila, he lives on an island. So instead of saying the 9 daughters of Aegir, you say the 9 daughters of the island dweller. For example, there could be endless variation here, but let's see, a ship can then be called the wolf of the 9 daughters of the island dweller. So maybe this metaphor will be perfect, and maybe it won't work when our poet continues to compose his poem. You see, the metaphor has to fit into the context, not only as far as meaning goes, but also with rhythm and rhyme and intonation. So our poet keeps another alternative up his sleeve. Rather than focusing on the 9 daughters, he may focus on the fact that the same 9 daughters are also considered the 9 mothers of the god Heimdallr, whose name means the great world. So the 9 waves are in fact the mothers of the present universe. So our poet may also describe our enemy ship as the wolf of the 9 mothers of Heimdallr. Although, to use the name Heimdallr is not enough, you have to make a riddle. You will know Heimdallr by something else, like his nickname, the White God, or by something that describes him, such as the hornblower. He's famous for blowing a horn. So, as a consequence, the word ship may now become the wolf of the hornblower's 9 mothers. Well, why stop there? The rules of poetry allows our poet to skip the 9 women and their relations altogether. It is enough to use just the name of one of these wave women. And our poet will pick the name that best describes the ship and its fate. Remember, this is after the battle. Our poet knows what happened to the ship. Let us say it was wrecked and the people on board drowned. Then, to indicate its fate, even before he has described it, our poet chooses the name Greiper, which means the grasping one, and indicate the kind of wave that grasps you and pulls you down to certain death. So, positive. Suddenly, the poet sits with a metaphor that perfectly describes the ship in many different ways. It is a wolf, which indicates its deadliness and hostile intentions. It belongs to the wave that will drown it in the future. And this wave is also a giantess, and everybody knows that the giantesses ride wolves, because all giantesses are really identical to Hel, the goddess of the underworld, and the metaphor will now strengthen the impression of a dangerous and ill-fated ship already wed to death. Actually, there could be countless variations of this metaphor that describes an enemy ship. Our poet may now turn to the word wolf and decide to use some metaphor for wolf instead, and so on. He will draw on mythology and cosmology, the world of the supernatural, and it does not stop here. This is just the word ship. He will have to go through the same kind of process for every noun in the whole poem, and it's not going to be a short poem. The listeners, before they get drunk that is, will find the end result, the poem, to be a refreshing riddle that has to be solved, each and every word, and they have to have vast knowledge of the mythical world in order to understand it. It is such a piece of art that the poet will probably find himself provided for another year because of it. People recognize the power of these and the impressive mind work that is behind these poems. These people, the Vikings, they were barbarians, they were primitives compared to the surrounding world in their time, but their minds were not primitive. Sophistication runs deep in the human brain and far precedes the sophistication of modern society. I have to finish here, but I will continue directly with the same subject next time, coming soon on the Lady of the Labyrinth's channel. That would be mine. So, good night.